What we see here. Gary, can you see? Did you see one down by the trail we walked over? Okay, this is a fossilised log and it's photographed in the handbook, little booklet you got this morning, the details, and you can figure out, well, it goes under the sand there and it goes all the way up there. We estimate it's somewhere around 80-90 feet long, okay? And it's a huge log, and it's being petrified, it's being silicified. In other words, silica, which is window glass that's a gel in solution, has permeated into the woody structure of the log and replaced the organic tissues, filled in all the cellular structure. And how long does that take? Well, you can do it in the laboratory in 24 hours if you really want to, if you have the right solutions. Actually, in Australia, in the outback, they've had wooden fence posts that have been there for 70 years, and they go to pull them out and they're petrified at the bottom because of the silica in the groundwater. It was interesting because I wrote an article about that some years ago, and lo and behold, there was a paper in a secular journal reporting on some experiments by some Japanese scientists. They put 7 pieces of wood dangled it in a hot volcanic spring, hot volcanic water, and every year they took out a sample and looked at it under the microscope, and within 7 years the last one had totally petrified. And the interesting thing is, in their article, which was published in the secular literature, they actually referenced my article in the creationist literature, which is pretty neat.
Yes.
So a couple of things. This rock unit that's in, those of you who are on my bus, I pointed it out. On the other bus, if you may recall, if you looked out the window, and you could see the reddy brown cliff, and there was this little band at the top, and boulders fell down, and some of them were sitting on pedestals, mushroom rocks, okay? This is called the Shinnerup conglomerate. This unit, it actually looks quite sandy here, but we're going to go up further and you'll see there's pebbles and cobbles in it. Okay, the pebbles and cobbles and sand, they're size terms. So sand that turns to stone is sandstone. Silt that turns to stone is siltstone. Mud that turns to stone is mudstone. See, we're pretty smart geologists. And those are size terms. Mud, silt, sand, then you get up to pebbles and cobbles and boulders. They're size terms, okay? And you'll find a lot of these boulders, pebbles and cobbles, are sort of floating, look like they're floating in the sand, which is how it happens actually. When you get a slurry and the sediment water mixture reaches 40 or 50%, okay, that is then very dense. It's denser than clear water, and it's so dense that boulders will actually float near the top of the slurry or the debris flow. And Lord willing, if we get into one side canyon, we'll actually show you where there was a debris flow. You can see the boulders at the top, not at the bottom, at the top. And so they'll float. And so when the current slows down, it just all gets dumped in a heap. And so these pebbles you'll see in a moment are sitting in this conglomerate. Now this conglomerate unit averages about 50 feet thick, and it covers 100,000 square miles that we know of now. Okay, it could have covered more than that in the past. So think of it as a nice flat pancake, really extensive pancake. Now the secular geologists think in terms of the present is the key to the past. And so they look at present day processes to try and explain how the rocks formed in the past. Of course, they deliberately reject the scriptures, which tell us we know what happened in the past because God has told us, and what happened in the past explains what we see in the present. It's the other way around, okay? So think about it. Where today do we see 50-foot thick layer with pebbles and fossil logs in it forming over an area of 100,000 square miles? Nowhere. The closest they talk about to this is, say, on the delta of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra rivers down there, over there in Bangladesh. But we don't see the sort of channels that you see there. This is one massive pancake unit that just went, got dumped here. And the logs are part of that. This is the unit, by the way. If you look across, and we'll see it more when we get up the top. See that reddish brown, that variegated unit there above the buses? Okay. That's the Shinle Formation, the Shinle, C-H-I-N-L-E. And it's underneath us here. The Chinnerup conglomerate is the top part of that rock unit. That is the unit that you see in the Painted Desert, that you see at the Petrified National Forest. And these are the same sorts of logs as you see in the...
Which unit is that again?
See where the buses are? Just above the buses, see all your greys and reds and... Okay, that's the Shinle Formation, which is the same as in the Painted Desert and is over there in the Petrified Forest National Park. Okay? Now, one thing you'll notice about... And so we're above the rim rock of the Grand Canyon. Those of you who flew out this morning, you'll remember we climbed up to over the North Rim, and where that was snow, that was the North Rim. We crossed the road that goes from Jacobs Lake to the North Rim Overlook, and then we went over a slope and we came down. We came down we dropped the layers, the same layers that are at the North Rim, dropped down 3,000 feet. The same layer we're standing on when we're having breakfast at Marble Canyon is the same layer that's up there at the top of the North Rim and the South Rim that you stand on at the rim, okay? And we'll talk more about that. These layers above that we're on now are above that, and we'll say more in a minute up there, okay? And so we're going to see these today and this morning, and then we're not going to see them again because we're going to disappear below the rim, okay? Now, the interesting thing here is that this tree has been stripped of all its foliage. And as far as we know, it was probably a seed fern. Okay? So where do we see the foliage fossilised? We find it fossilised about 4 units further down. 4 units further down would be something like 70, 80 million, 100 million years earlier. So do you think that sort of doesn't compute? The foliage got fossilised and the logs sort of floated around for another 100 million years before they got buried? No, it doesn't make any sense. Makes more sense that they were swept away and stripped of their foliage. The foliage sank immediately and got buried. More layers came in, and then the logs eventually got waterlogged and sank. And that's what happened at Mount St Helens at Spirit Lake. The logs were floating on the lake, and then they got waterlogged and they started sinking. And so this screams the flood, because you've got this massive layer. In fact, we're going to talk about this repeatedly, pancake layers over huge, thin layers over huge, massive areas. We don't see anything like that happening today. This is the Chinnerup conglomerate is only small compared to some of the pancake layers that we're going to be seeing and talking about on the canyon. There's one other interesting historical thing about these logs in the Chinnerup conglomerate. Because when this was buried, it had a lot of carbon in it, okay? Carbon. In that, the reason why the Shinle Formation has all those variegated colours, it has a lot of volcanic ash in it. Volcanic ash, because volcanic rocks have a gradation in composition from a basalt to a granitic composition. The volcanic equivalent as a granite is called a rhyolite. Those of you who've been to Yellowstone would have heard about rhyolite at Yellowstone, okay? And it's usually very explosive. Now granites, because of the composition of these rocks, granites often have uranium in them. And so the volcanic ash has uranium in it, And what happens is the groundwaters dissolve the uranium and flow through the layer, and then it hits one of these logs where there's carbon. And the uranium precipitates out. And so in the 1950s, 1960s, there were uranium mines all the way around the Colorado Plateau that were primarily in this Shinnerup conglomerate and some of the other sandstones, and a lot of it was related to these fossil logs. There's actually an old uranium mine that's been totally rehabilitated right at the Grand Canyon near Powell Point. It was called the Orphan Uranium Mine. And what happened there is that the Redwall limestone is full of caves, and it collapsed, the layers above collapsed into it and created a way that water could go down, and the water could leach uranium and copper, because there's a bit of copper in there as well, which also gives us some of the variation in colour, and it precipitates against the limestone to form copper carbonate or malachite and azurite, and also uranium carbonate. And so that was mined, and it's only in the last 5 years it's been rehabilitated. Before COVID it was rehabilitated there. But there's plaques there talking about it. So that's a bit of history about that.
Does uranium have any impact upon the half-life of the carbon? Because you've got the carbon in the tree and the uranium that permeates it.
No, it doesn't.
Has anybody done a C14 on this one?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have one other question.
Is that C14 is a carbon test?
So this is kind of, we're on a mound, as it were. Is that from uplift that occurred later?
Yeah, you can see that the layers here are slightly sloping. Okay, and so you're going to have flexures. There's a fault line through here, and you'll get the layers below moved, and we're going to talk about that more. And the layers above were still soft, and they sort of bent. And so there's been a bit of uplift in here. You can see it sort of tilted up a little bit. Okay, let's take a walk. Can you see something beneath your feet, Marnie? Just in front of your toes.
Rock. Grass, weeds.
No.
Well, you got layers here.
See that groove in front of your toes?
Groove, yeah.
Oh,
And
yes.
there's another groove here.
Oh,
The width of that is the width of a wagon wheel.
cool.
This was the honeymoon trail. Okay.
I can feel it in my bones.
And as Joe said, the bride got to make the trip once. The bridegroom got to make the trip many times.
True.
Okay. So this was part of the honeymoon trail. Okay, and it came up through here, and we're going to go up here in a minute, and you'll see another part of the roadway where they actually built up the sides with embankments. You can see the rock stacked up to provide an embankment. Okay, notice how now we're getting the pebbles, and that you'll notice there's bands of them and pods of them. Remember what I was saying, how in a slurry, the pebbles will just float along in the middle of all this sand. Okay, and then when the current eases, it all just drops. And so they don't settle to the bottom, they just sit within the matrix in which they were carried in the slurry flow. Okay, so let's go up
Andrew,
here.
what's with the cave over there?
Someone asked me the question, is the river going to stay this clear all the way? Have a look downstream. We came across a little bridge and we crossed the Paria River that was running. See where it comes in? See the mud that it's adding to the river? Okay, so chances are the river won't be clear for very long as we go downstream. Okay, further down we know there's already other side streams that are running and bringing in further mud. Okay, right. So, remember Joe, if you look down here you can see the bottom, another trail, part of the honeymoon trail, different water level, and you can see it better from when we get on the raft as we go downstream. You can see it follows along the bank and then it climbs up a little bit up to the reddy brown rock there. Okay, and see all the See all that grassed area over there? That's the Lonely Dell Ranch that Joe referred to, where Emma was, the 19th wife of John Doyle Lee, who, by the way, was executed for his. There was a wagon trail a wagon train that came across, and the Mormons conspired with the Native Americans to ambush it, and he was implicated in the Meadow Mountain Massacre and ended up getting executed. Okay, he was sent out here to hide away.
Is that a common thing that the Mormons were there?
I'm not sure exactly how common it was.
One Mormon, another guy. You were involved.
Okay, so if you look downstream, if you look downstream, as you go around the bend in the river there, you can see a lightish coloured rock underneath the red-brown. You can see more of an outcropping by the road on the other side. See that rock?
Yes.
Okay, on the bend and over the other side, above that road. That's the Kaibab limestone, which is the rim rock of the Grand Canyon. It's in the geological terminology, it's Permian. It's the very top unit of the so-called Paleozoic, and we'll say more about that on the trip, the Paleozoic. So, the red-brown unit is called the Moenkopai, and it is Triassic, or the earliest unit in the Mesozoic, or Mesozoic, okay? And so, where you see the red-brown changing over to the lighter coloured rock, that's the boundary between the Mesozoic and the Paleozoic in the geological strata column.
Way up high up there, you're saying, huh?
Pardon?
You say way up higher.
No, down by the river.
Okay.
Down by the river.
Just
Okay.
a small section.
Okay, you can just see it on the bend there.
Yeah.
Okay, and you can see the milky water in the distance on that other shore. That's the Paria River coming in with the mud. Okay, so looking across here, we've got the red-brown unit as the Moenkopai, all right? And then you've got the Shinnerup conglomerate that we're standing on, and above that you can see the Shinle. See the variegated rock unit there?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Okay, and there's a whole sequence of layers here. The top one there, you can see in the cliff, is the whitish one. That is 2,000 feet thick in Zion National Park. That is the Navajo sandstone. It's over 2,000 feet thick in Zion National Park. Okay, and so that Shinle forms a very hard. That Shinnerup conglomerate is at the bottom of the Shinle, and it forms a very hard unit. And you see what happens is that with freeze thaw in the cracks, it breaks off blocks and they fall down. Okay, you can see that. But notice something very significant. Look how clean these slopes are. Do we see a lot of debris? No, we don't. Someone asked me, what's that white stuff on the over there? See that white? Okay. Well, what happens is you get water in the rock. It has salts in it. And when it comes to the surface of the rock, the water evaporates and leaves behind the salt. Okay. Further downstream at lunchtime, I'll point out to you, you get, and you can see a little bit of it here, but you get a purpley, iridescent, dark stain on lots of rock surfaces. That's called desert varnish. And we'll talk more about that probably at lunchtime. So, here's the interesting thing. Most geologists regard the Colorado River as carving out the Grand Canyon, okay? And they suggest, remember, these layers that we're looking at were all deposited first before the canyon was carved through them, okay? The canyon wasn't here first, the layers were here first, and we'll say more about that. But they say that the canyon was carved out at least 6 million years ago by the Colorado River. Okay? Now, if that happened, what would you expect over 6 or 17 million years, depending on who you talk to? What you would expect to happen over that length of time?
Weathering.
Weathering.
Erosion.
You'd expect freeze thaw. These slopes should be absolutely littered with debris. They're not. They're clean. If on the other hand it was a lot of water in a little bit of time and it flushed out and carved out the canyon rapidly, it's going to take out all the debris with it and leave the slopes clean. And that's exactly what we see. You know, this happened, the canyon was carved out about 4,000 years ago, after the flood, probably, from what we can gather. Another pointer is that the rapids in the Grand Canyon are formed as a result of flash floods inside canyons. The flash floods bring debris and dump them in the main channel, and the Colorado River goes over that debris. Okay, think about it.
It's not moving.
If the Colorado River can't move out that debris now, even in historic floods before the dams, and we'll see evidence of where higher flood levels were at. You know, we're talking about 40,000 feet per cubic second. They'll talk about floods of 120,000 cubic feet per second. And the rapids are still there. Some of these rapids are identical. You can see some of the drawings from John Wesley Powell's expedition, and the boulders are still in exactly the same place. They haven't moved. So I beg the question: if the Colorado River isn't cleaning out its channel today, how could it possibly ever, over millions of years, carved out the Grand Canyon? I always remember that the first time I came to the canyon, I was standing at the rim, and there was a little boy with his mother, and there was a sign there, and the sign said, you know, over millions of years, the Colorado River carved out the Grand Canyon. The little boy turned to his mother and said, "Mummy, you mean that trickle of water down there carved out this canyon?" Out of the mouths of babes.
Yeah.
Okay, so, you know, little observations go a long way in helping clarify these issues. And so the canyon is carved after these layers have formed. And we'll talk more about this on the trip because we want to get on the river. So are there any questions already about anything that we've said so far?
So when you're talking debris, like boulders,
Yes?
like that,
Yep,
Yeah.
that's right.
then they should have been
That's
up
right.
higher.
No, there should
That's
just
right.
be the whole hillside
Now.
full of debris.
Okay.
Okay.
This is Cathedral Wash.
All right, just a couple of slight bumps here.
He's gonna get us. These are rapid.
Be safe. Sorry. No, we're going to white water raft. You guys hanging on it there? You ready? need his whole soul.
That's right.
Are formed by a side canyon that comes in left or right that brings in it's a flash flood, but they call it a debris flow, where it brings in big pieces of material. It can block the river and choke it off to where it creates these rapids. Now the interesting thing is, and Nate, you know that it's got the two sides coming in here. There's two side canyons coming in here. So this one at really low water is actually the rating goes up significantly because it's had debris come in from not only one side, which is Badger Creek, and then Jackass Creek is bringing in another whole nother canyon of material. So it's got rocks that have come in from both sides of this rapid, which is not common. Most of them are one canyon coming in. There's a few rapids that have been formed by pieces of rock that have broken off, or something that has come down and tumbled down into the river. But all these rapids are formed by these side canyons that bring in the debris, okay? So today we got some good water. We have an excellent boatman, by the way. Joe is a fantastic driver, and so is Johnny. Johnny's an excellent boatman. So we got both boats have very good drivers. We got plenty of water today, so it's going to be a medium size. It's a pretty small rapid compared to some of the stuff you guys are going to see down below. But this kind of gives you a little insight on how the rapids are formed in Grand Canyon.
Why is this one called Badger?
It is called Badger because there was a guy named Jacob Hamlin who was a Mormon also, and he was down. They called him the Buckskin Apostle. He was around the same time period as John Wesley Powell. And they captured or caught a badger. I'm not sure which side. Do you know which side? On this right side. They caught the badger on this right side. And then the next rapid, when we get down to it, has the kind of part two. Okay, we'll talk about the next rapid and then how Jacob Hamlin's catching of the badger led to the naming of the second rapid.
So this is Badger and this is Jackass.
Yes, sir.
So what's the Jackass story?
Probably just some mule that was up there. Anyway, they called it Jackass Creek. Good question.
Everybody ready to get wet?
We caught the badger up this canyon here.
Hang on.
You're good. Watch your feet.
You gotta have
Here we go.
There you go. Yeah. You can do that. Especially the bigger rapids like what we have.
Yeah, Brady. Yeah, baby. I'm gonna go down in the sand and get down there. This super, like... Could you try this? Gradual. Yeah. Plus this dude's here, I don't want to... Yeah, exactly.
Are you wet?
There's some more. No, she's completely...
How'd you guys do over there?
Oh, yeah.
Pretty good. There's an older there.
Are you wet?
Yeah,
That's from that.
All right, you guys.
All right.
Yeah.
You got wet a little bit there, Joe.
Yeah, buddy.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what they say? Yeah.
Orientate ourselves. We've just gone below Badger Rapid, so we're just around mile 8. Okay, that was our first serious rapid. And if you look downstream, you can see at the skyline, you've got a cliff, then a slope, then a cliff. Okay, and usually that's a prominent profile. And the reason is you've got harder layers and softer layers. Okay, now when we started, we went first of all through the Kaibab. Okay, after we went below the red-brown Monkopai that we were at Lee's Ferry. Okay, and then the cliff line was sheer cliff up until the bridge, and it's only below the bridge that you can actually make out the Turalweep as a slope. Okay, back there it was almost a continuous cliff through the Kaibab and the Turalweep, and you couldn't tell where the boundary was. Okay, because the two units were so similar to one another. And the interesting thing is, there's supposed to be 5 to 10 million years missing at the boundary between the Kaibab and the Turalweep. Okay, and they're supposed to have been formed as the waters came up, went down, waters came up in there over millions of years. And so there should have been an erosion surface on top of the earlier form layer, which is the same. When you come down to the Coconino, see that boundary with the red-brown rock underneath the Hermit? Look how smooth that boundary is. Again, there's supposed to be 5 to 10 million years missing at that boundary. And the reason they say that, at that boundary, if you go 70 miles down south to Sedona area, there's a rock unit there between the Hermit and the Coconino called the Schneebler Hill Formation. 800 to 1,000 feet thick. And so they say that took 5 to 10 million years, and nothing was happening in the Grand Canyon area to deposit the Coconino on top of the Hermit. There was a break. But what would happen over 5 to 10 million years? Wouldn't you expect there to be erosion and gullies? But that's really flat and knife edge. And we'll come back to that boundary in a minute. But as you come down that slope from the Turalweep, notice that at the top of that cliff, you can still see a little bit of bedding, layering. Okay, we call that bedding. Okay, and it's interesting because you actually get the Turalweep and a little bit of Coconino, a little bit of Turalweep, they're intertongued, which indicates that there was continuous deposition as material was coming in from a different source, and you still had a little bit left of the previous material in there. Okay. Now we come down to the Coconino, and on the lead boat, Nate pointed out to you, as I pointed out to my group, if you looked across, you could see, and you can see a hit of it up here. You can see that within the extensive horizontal layer, okay, there is a sloping bands. Okay, we call those cross beds. That are an angle or across the dynamic layering. And let me put this in context. The Coconino sandstone you can trace from the Mexican border up to Canada throughout the western United States, almost 1 million square miles. So remember we talked about earlier the Shinnerup was only 100,000. This is a pancake 300 feet thick that covered 1 million square miles. Okay? Now, of course, it's been given different names in different places. If you go to Colorado, to Colorado Springs, and you go to the Garden of the Gods, it's actually tilted up there in the Garden of the Gods, and it's called the Lions Sandstone there. The reason is, of course, the geologists were working in different areas and they didn't talk to one another, so they gave the layers different names. Notice there's a two-word naming system because there's many sandstone layers in the sequence and many limestone layers. So you attach a second name to it: Kaibab limestone, Turaweep limestone, to distinguish those two limestones. The Coconino sandstone. Further down we're going to come to the Tapeats sandstone. Okay, so you've got this huge layer called the Coconino sandstone. It's got these cross beds or cross angular sloping layers in them. What does that mean? Well, if you go to a desert, okay, what do you find in deserts? You find desert sand dunes. Or you say dunes, I say dunes, okay, translation. And you all know what happens in a desert. The wind blows up the backside and it gets to the crest and the sand, well actually the wind goes over the top and then there's a back eddy and the sand gets plastered on the front, okay? So what's happening is you're getting erosion from the back, blowing up and dumping it at the front. So the front of the dune keeps advancing. If there's another dune in front, it's actually going to bury the back side of the dune in front of it. Okay? And so what's going to happen is that when it gets buried, what you're going to see? You're going to see the fossilized remains of the dune front. Okay? And that's what has been interpreted as these crossbeds in the Coconino sandstone, fossilized dune fronts. Okay, and so if you go to the park and you go to the bookstore, you'll find a book there called Grand Canyon Monument to an Ancient Earth. It's written by a number of Christian old earth geologists, and they will say to you, how could you have a desert sand dune layer, the Coconino, in the middle of a global flood? See, so this is proof perfect that you flood geologists have got it all wrong. And you'll find that they've got a photograph in there where they've actually got a marker like a protractor to measure the angle. Why do they do that? Because the angle is very important. The angle of that crossbed is very significant. Because you see, if you get a bucket of dry sand, okay, and dump it on the ground, it's going to slope like that, and you can measure the slope. That's usually between 30 and 34 degrees, okay, with a bucket of dry sand. Well, it just so happens that you can get underwater dunes called sand waves, okay? Now, if you were adventurous and jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and went to the bottom of the channel there, the water coming in from the Pacific Ocean with the tide is so strong that it's heaped up the sand into sand waves. The same on Long Island Sound off New York and Connecticut. And it's well documented in the literature. You can do the same, we call it a flume. Okay, you can get a big warehouse and you build a long aquarium like glass-sided flume, they call it. Okay, and you got water source up here, you put sand in there and you get the water current flowing and it will create the sand waves, and you can actually measure the angle of the front of the sand wave. Okay, and the angle is typically between 15 and 25 degrees, average about 20 degrees. And so you have an empirical test as to whether the sand wave, the sand has been deposited in desert conditions, dry, or underwater, because you'll produce the same sort of crossbeds in the sandstone layer. In fact, if you look over here, see what's happened? You've actually got here the remains of an earlier, the last time they raise the river level to rebuild the beaches, which is what's going to happen this week. The sand is going to be brought up out of the channel, and the higher water flow is going to dump it up on the beach as the water comes down, and you can actually see the layering, and there's a hit there across, very shallow cross layering in that sand. And so you can see what's happened when you had drier conditions and less water flow. It's actually eroded into the beach and dropped the level. So they're going to rebuild this beach next week when they have this high water flow. So the interesting thing is, there was a guy in 1938 who had a paper published in the Journal of Geology, published by the University of Chicago Press. And he had done measurements of the Coconino Sandstone crossbeds. Okay, this is 1938. It's in a journal published by the University of Chicago. And guess what he found? The angles of the crossbeds are generally between 15 and 25 degrees. Okay, so in other words, the data is being ignored. And in fact, if you go to that book where they've got the protractor, they've got it at 34 degrees, but they're not measuring the correct angle. You see, you just don't go up to a rock face. You've actually got to find an exposed sloping surface and you pour water on it. Okay, and the water will take the shortest route. Okay, which will be the at right angles to the axis of the top of the bed. So that's the angle that you measure. And you just don't put a protractor up to the rock face. You've got to find out which is the slope, the correct slope to measure. And when you do that, John Whitmore, who's at Cedarville University, he and others have been around and replicated the work that was back done in 1938. And so, and they produced the results and they're published in the literature. And lots of other things that they found in the Coconino Sandstone. They also found evidence of dolomite, which is a marine mineral. Okay, you don't get it formed in the desert. We're going to see it 2 miles further down after lunch. Hopefully we'll make another stop, and we'll actually see a block of Coconino Sandstone that's got fossil footprints in it. And we'll talk about those down there. Okay, so that's the story of the Coconino Sandstone. We have abundant evidence that it wasn't formed in a desert sand environment. You know, they refer to and you can do this. In the Coconino Sandstone, there's a little silver grey shiny mineral. It's called mica, or muscovite mica, named after Moscow, and it's very soft. Okay, and if you go to say the coast of Africa, Namibia, where there's sand that's been washed down the Orange River Delta, and then washed along the beach, and then it's been blown inland to form desert sand dunes. The mica is down on the beaches and in the river sands, but it's not in the desert. Why? Because in the wind, the grains crash into one another and destroy. The sand has a hardness of 7, the muscovite has a hardness of only 2.5. It's very soft, and so it's destroyed. In fact, John and others did measurements on coastal dunes here in the United States to show that within 100 feet of the beach, all the muscovite has been destroyed in the desert sand dune environment. Whereas underwater, so on the coast of Namibia, you've got the muscovite has been transported nearly hundreds of miles, and it's still there in the beach sands because in the water, suspended in the water, there's less knocking of the grains together, and the softer mineral isn't crushed. So when you look at the Coconino Sandstone, what do you find? You find muscovite all through that. And in fact, as I will show you later on in my research, I found muscovite in the Tapete sandstone, the Bright Angel shale, and in the Muab limestone. Even in limestones here in the Grand Canyon, you're getting the muscovite. And so if it wasn't water deposited, it would get destroyed. And so that's another piece of evidence that confirms this. Now, I pointed out to my group as we came to saw the boundary, first stop where there was a boundary with the hermit, okay? Did you point out that bit?
Yep.
You could see some white streaks going from the Coconino sandstone down into the hermit. Some of you are nodding your heads, you might remember seeing that, okay? Well, that's interesting because if you go down the Bright Angel Trail, at that boundary, those streaks are a foot wide or more, and they go something like 50 feet down into the hermit. And the further away you get from the Bright Angel Trail area, they get smaller and thinner. It's very interesting. What are they? Well, John Whitmore has shown that what's happened is there were cracks that opened up as a result of earthquakes, okay? And down there on the Bright Angel Trail, you've got a humongous fault line that goes across the north-south across the canyon, okay? And Phantom Ranch is in the side canyon produced by that fault. So that the earthquake was most severe there, so it opened up the fractures more, bigger, and what happened? The sand from the Coconino sandstone fell down into the cracks and filled in the cracks. We call that injectites, okay? And think about it, okay? The Bright Angel Fault was moving, perhaps 200 million years after the sandstone and the shale were formed, and yet the sand was still soft enough to fall down into cracks in the layer underneath. It doesn't make any sense, in fact. It makes more sense, of course, if it was during the flood. You get all the layers formed very quickly. The earth movements occur at the end of the flood when these layers are still soft enough for the sand to form like still a bit of a slurry that falls into the cracks. And it's rather interesting because John Whitmore had a poster presentation at the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America in which he presented this information. And one of the park geologists came across and was really, really interested and got really, really excited about it. And then went off, came back an hour later and got really angry at John. Because she discovered when she went off and talked to colleagues that he was a creationist, a flood geologist, and he was presenting the implications for Noah's flood. So she got really, really upset. But it did get published in the secular literature, in the Journal of Sedimentary Geology. So it did get published in the secular literature. So that's what we call injectites. So it meant that those 5 to 10 million years between the Coconino and the hermit below just didn't happen. Couldn't have happened. So this is where, in fact, the creationists, the creation flood geologists are doing more significant research in the Grand Canyon than the secular geologists. And just to show you, when I was doing the research on the Tapete sandstone, which is the bottom layer, and I'll talk about it again tonight, I wanted to review all that was in the literature about that sandstone. And I couldn't find any photographs of that sandstone under the microscope. I had to go all the way back to 1945, and they were black and white photographs. No one had published anything since looking at that sandstone under the microscope. And that's very basic geological research. And so these days they go out and collect samples and put it in a mass spectrometer or fancy equipment, and they get these numbers out, and they haven't done their homework looking at the basics of the rock under the microscope. So that's an interesting story, and we're going to take up some of this tonight again. What we'll do is we'll get to camp and we'll get set up, and the guides will have a bit of downtime because they've been working all day before they work in the kitchen. Because some of us had an early start this morning, we're going to try and do the teaching before dinner, so that when dinner finishes and it gets dark, you can just go off to bed. So I'm just giving you a heads up now so that you know that plan to gather around when we call you, because we want to try and fit the teaching in before dinner rather than after dinner when everyone's getting tired.
Yeah, and that'll be kind of the plan that we have every day. We'll kind of get into camp, time to kind of set up your little campsite, maybe a little bit of time to relax. When the crew gets ready to start dinner, we'll probably hear a call for circle time. And so that's everyone's cue to come on down, drop what you're doing, come to the chair circle. We kind of created a little Grand Canyon living room set up. And so that's when a lot of the teaching is going to happen in the evenings. And then in the morning, we'll do a little devotion time as well before we get on the boats and go downriver. So fantastic. Thank you, Andrew, for all of that right now. We'll have more talking about that throughout this week. We've got a lot of teaching stage for you guys this week. We also have some time set aside for Q&A too. So sometimes there are going to be some really big, good questions that you might ask. And we might give you a short answer, but we might say, let's save that for the the big talk with everybody, because there are some really things that, on my boat already, we had people asking about dinosaurs. Who doesn't love dinosaurs? So that might be a great Q&A topic.
Yeah.
And so a lot of stuff that we're seeing, we're going to talk about throughout this trip too.
So one other thing I was going to point out, some of you probably noticed back there was a more recent rock fall because it was fresher on the surface.
Yeah.
See that dark material on the cliff face? That's called desert varnish. Desert varnish. It's manganese oxides and algae. The algae fed off the water that came out of it and died. Okay, Joe, ready? Over to you.
Oh, thanks. That's perfect timing.
Teach you guys how to wash your hands.
Hey, folks. Yeah.
That's a piece of Toorawee Formation. And that comes from way up there. This material is Coconino sandstone. And what we're looking at is the top of a crossbed, okay? A crossbed surface, and it's virtually landed right side up when it came down, which is perfect for us. Okay? And what we're going to see, see this knob here at the front? That used to be up where Nate is walking. It used to be level. This has slid down, okay, in the last 5 or so years. So we're anxious for it not to keep moving down, because Nate's been squirting on what are fossilised footprints of a amphibian or reptile, okay, and so you can see some here. You can see the claw marks, you can see the pads, and what's happened is the critter was actually climbing up the slope, okay, because you can see where it dug its toes in, and you can see the pushback, okay. Now I want you to think, if this was dry desert sand, you have a look at some of these, you'll see that they're well formed, they've kept their shape. What happens in dry desert sand? You don't get a distinctive shape. The sand has to be wet or moist, okay? Because the secular geologists say, oh well, there was the dew in the morning, and it was wet enough for the critters to leave their footprints. But the interesting thing is, and everywhere we find these footprints, and they're found in copious places in the Coconino sandstone, down below Phantom Ranch, all the way up here, the critter was always going up the slope. Always, the critters were going up the slope. And we noticed that they weren't necessarily going straight up the slope, they were actually sort of going a little bit sideways as they were going up the slope. And in a few places, they must have got knocked off their feet and then they land over here and keep going. So that tells you that there was something that they were concerned about. Now think about it for a moment. Remember what I said when you have the sand, wave, and water. Okay, it's the same as a desert sand dune. As the water comes over the slope, it back eddies, and you've actually got very little current on the front face. So you can imagine a critter is swimming in the water. He goes over the crest and he follows the back eddy, and he thinks, okay, I can finally put my feet down. But he can see the sky above, and he wants to get air. So what's he going to do? He's going to go up to try and go up the surface. And of course what happens is when he gets to the top, the current's going to take him away again. And sometimes you get a bit of lateral movement, and it knocks him off his side. He's struggling in the current. So it's quite clear that water current is sufficient. And also how are you going to get preservation? If it's wet, he's going to leave a nice firm print, and you're going to have more sand being washed over the crest that's going to bury that print fairly quickly and preserve it. Whereas in a desert sand dune, okay, it might be the dew, but what's going to happen? It's going to dry out, and in the sun it's going to lose all its definition, and it's going to get obliterated in no time at all. Okay, so this is again evidence consistent with the critters that's happening during the flood with the Coconino sandstone. Now here's the interesting thing is, where do we find the body fossils of these creatures? As I was going to explain tonight, again, I'll repeat this, all the layers that we're going through in the canyon only have marine fossils in them, apart from those free fern leaves in the hermit. We don't find the bodies of these creatures in the Coconino sandstone where their footprints are preserved. The body fossils are above the rim rock of the Grand Canyon. We don't find them for millions of years later. In fact, that's a common feature in the fossil record. We find the footprints before we find the body fossils, and that's often separated by millions of years. The same creatures. Okay, so it begs the question about the millions of years, doesn't it? It makes more sense that the critter left these footprints. Within a few days, other layers were deposited on top, and then it got overwhelmed and buried higher up in the sequence, a week or two later. So that's the story here. Now Nate's going to shoot some of these with spray gun. Now there's photographs in the book that you got given this morning. The same with the fossil log. It's in that book. So you'll be able to refer back to it with your photographs, these features where we've stopped. Okay, so you can see claw marks in a few spots. It's actually getting much more difficult. Some of the best ones are up there. Yeah, that's a good thing. So what happens if you want to come back around this way? There's a few up there that are being exposed. If you come back on that side, and some of you come back up on this ledge here, you can look over there. So take it in turns. Be careful. Just only go to this ledge here.
So are there more prints underneath this there?
Probably, yes. Dennis, up there to the left. Can you see the?
Oh, they're small prints.
They're right up there. They're only less than an inch across. Oh, jeez.
I saw the ones with your strings done.
I can't really see it very. It's not really good here. You might have a little bit.
Ooh,
Get up there and you'll see.
that's not going to go well.
Yeah, get some super glue.
I'll move to the side so you can get it.
Shuku's great, man.
Oh yeah, I
He
can
does
use that.
Yeah.
So
Never
take it in
done.
turns.
Never hard.
Let it boil, and while that was boiling, he decided he was going to take a jaunt up the canyon, right? Well, when he got back, there was a layer of soap on the top of his pot, right? So the high alkali content of the water mixed with the animal fat from the badger and made soap. So he called it Soap Creek.
Soap Creek. There you
On
go.
the right there. And then Soap Creek Rapid coming up around the corner.
Guys, this rapid has the distinction of being the last one to be run successfully between Lee's Ferry and the Grand Wash Cliffs, 277 miles through the Grand Canyon. So the guys that ran it by accident. It was such high water, they thought it was, the badger was flushed out. They came down here and they ran it, no problem. So, wasn't always the case. It's actually can be a pretty technical rapid. For the first 15 years of my career, it was fairly easy to run. We always pretty much just ran down the left side. Then a couple of boulders rolled in the rapid and made that left side fairly impassable. So now we usually do a cut from the left to the right or to the center, and then back again to the center, kind of left to right to center. So it's about twice as long, and I would say maybe twice as difficult as Badger Rapid, okay? Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Twice as what?
This is Soap Creek Rapid.
Nothing wrong with that. She's gonna take all the water from me up behind.
I'm not gonna say anything.
Find out. I'm gonna grab on to you as I go over.
Yeah, I heard all about it.
Trip. We had to drag them through over. That one was more exposed. We hung up on that one. And then in between those two rocks and those two on shore. This is known as Brown's Riffle, named after Frank Mason Brown. He was a coal magnate out of Denver, and he financed the third known expedition through the Grand Canyon in 1889. He hired Robert Brewster Stanton, an engineer, to come down here. Stanton actually organized the trip, got in touch with John Wesley Powell. Powell said, you better bring more supplies than you think you'll need. You need some really hardy ash or oak boats, and everyone should have a life jacket. Brown didn't want to pay for any of that stuff, and he paid for that decision with his life right here. They believed the water was forcing along the right shore here. His boat flipped over. He got caught in this eddy on the left, did one eddy lap, then he was downstream. They never found his body. Frank Mason Brown died right here in July of 1889. those would not be the first or the last. That would not be the last fatality of that trip. We'll hear more about that trip later on. But that is known as Brown's Ripple. Great Brown.
Coastal zone environment, so it has like a, you know, the tide would come in and out.
Okay, so that's what creates all those layers like that.
Is it under risk of falling?
Always. Everything is. This place is falling apart. This place is all falling apart. You never know, but yeah, I mean everything is subject to falling or eroding or.
We're now in what's called the Supai Gorge. Down in here, you'll see a nice little slot canyon in the red rock. Whoa! Ready for the rapids. Cool right back in there. Not too bad, pretty cool. Alright.
There's a cold chocolate back here too. Some more ribeye.
Yeah, buddy.
You guys up front, make sure you have two holding handholds off to the side.
Yeah, baby. Hang on.
Straps, not
Very wet. I shielded you, man.
Wow! Yeah! Way to go, Dave! Yeah, baby!
That was a good hole on the
How about that left side perfectly, huh? Here we go. And right
I think we hit it a little harder than we did.
I think we did.
Right on.
I still hold down my
I
didn't buckle up here.
Went all the way.
It all went in.
Thinking above.
Yeah.
That one on the left.
That rapid was House Rock Rapid. Boulder Narrows.
Boulder Narrows. Did you see the videos of that? Where they're like, it's like 120,000 or something. They're like going over the top of that on the boats in the late 50s. Yeah, it's like the guys. This was in the 1950s. Late 1950s. They're like going over this thing. There was no rock. It was just it was like a rapid kind of thing, but it was just kind of a little.
To the flood and to the post-flood as we go right up to Bryce Canyon. So you've got the whole gamut of Earth history, even from a biblical perspective, right here in the canyon. And what we've been focusing on so far is evidence for the flood. And I've already given you some teasers, as it were, as we stopped at different sites. We've talked about some of the factors. And so we'll say more as we go downstream, but we want to be brief tonight because they'll call dinner and we want to have our dinner and let you settle in for the night. But most people don't realise that these layers that we're going through, and I've got here my PowerPoint presentation.
Yes.
We started up here at the Kaibab, remember, soon after we launched from Lees Ferry. We've come down through the Kaibab, the Turawit, the Coconino and the Hermit. We're basically the base of the Hermit where we had lunch. We talked about those 4 units. And this afternoon we've come into the Supai group. Now in geology you have the basic unit is called a formation. So the Kaibab represents a formation. But because it's made up of limestone, it's just called the Kaibab limestone. Whereas the Turawit is actually the Turawit formation because you go to some areas and there's a bit of sandstone in it or there's a bit of siltstone, so there's variations. So, this morning we talked about the Shinley Formation, but within the Shinley Formation there was the Shinnerup conglomerate. That's called a member. That's a unit within a formation that's distinguished. And then when you got a group of members that seem to be related to one another, we call that a group. And so at the moment we're in the Supai group, and we've come down through the top member of the Supai group, which is the Esplanade sandstone. Okay, this is a sandstone here, and as you can see, it forms a nice cliff of its own. And we're in what is called the Supai Gorge here because we've got Supai. We've got a canyon within the canyon, so to speak. And so tomorrow we're going to go down through the rest of the Supai, down into the Red Wall. As we go down through the Roaring Twenties, we're going to go into the Red Wall limestone. We're going to go all the way through the Red Wall limestone tomorrow. And tomorrow night we may be camping somewhere in the Muave or Bright Angel, just depending how far we get. So all these units that make up the walls of the Grand Canyon, there's something like 4,500 feet of them. They only contain marine fossils. And one of the interesting things is that most geologists don't realise is that you would think that marine creatures that live on the ocean floor, you'd expect them to find them buried on the ocean floor. But we don't. We don't find marine fossils on the ocean floor. We find the marine fossils buried up on the continent. So that means that the ocean waters had to cover the continent, and everyone agrees that that's the case. And so first evidence for the flood is the fact that you've got marine fossils buried up on the continents. You've even got marine fossils near the top of Mount Everest, which gives you a clue that Mount Everest wasn't there before the flood because it's made up of flood-deposited fossil-bearing layers. Mount Everest was formed at the end of the flood, okay? So the waters didn't have to cover Mount Everest. Mount Everest is a product of the flood. It wasn't there before the flood, okay? So these are the things that you learn as you so that's the first evidence for the flood. The fact that we've got marine creatures buried up on the continents. And then we find that many of these creatures, and we're going to talk about fossils 2 nights from now, we're going to talk more about the fossils. We find that the fossils are buried en masse in graveyards, and a lot of them are exquisitely preserved. And that requires rapid burial and in great numbers. Tomorrow we're going to see a number of fossils, and we're going to talk about fossils a bit more. Red Wall Cavern, we're going to see fossils in the Red Wall limestone. Lord willing, we'll stop at and see the Nautiloid fossils near the bottom of the Red Wall limestone. And so you're going to see a lot about these fossils, and many of them are very well preserved. And in some instances, for example, in England, they found a fossil squid with the ink still present in its sac. And the fossil is now on display in a museum with a drawing of the original critter using the ink that was in the ink sac of the fossil that's supposed to be 400 odd million years old. Okay? And of course, we found soft tissue in dinosaur bones. We're seeing the trilobites that we'll see evidence of trilobites in the Tapete sandstone, the bottom layer of the canyon. You actually find the trilobite eye lenses preserved. And we're finding more and more exquisite preservation. We've got on display in the Creation Museum a fossil of a fish with a fish in its mouth. So it was about to take its meal, and the two of them were buried and fossilised. In the Ark, we've got a drawing of a famous fossil from Germany of an ichthyosaur 6 feet long, just given birth to a baby, and the two, mother and baby, are fossilised. I mean, this is, you just don't get this by, things don't hang around for thousands of years by grain deposition to fossilise them. The very preservation of the fossils indicates catastrophic conditions to bury them. And so that's evidence number 2. You've also heard today that many of these layers extend over vast areas. The Coconino Sandstone, we said, covered 1 million square miles in western US, and it's 300 feet thick. It's a huge pancake layer. But the Red Wall limestone that we see tomorrow, which is full of fossils, we can see it right across North America. It's got caves in it. So the Mammoth Caves in Kentucky, it's the Red Wall limestone equivalent. The Shenandoah Caverns in Virginia, that's the Red Wall limestone. You can see it up in Wyoming, it's the Madison limestone up there. And so it's spread right across North America, but you can see the same limestone at the Burren in Ireland, underneath Killarney, Ross Castle at Killarney. It's got the same features in it, the same fossils. You see the same Red Wall limestone equivalent over in the Yorkshire Dales of England. You see the same limestone equivalent over in the Himalayas. You can trace it over several continents. And the Tapete Sandstone, similarly, you can trace it across North Africa to southern Israel. And you can see it, I saw a paper just a few weeks ago, you can trace it across Asia to eastern China and South Korea, all the way from the Grand Canyon. And so these layers are pancakes that essentially you can trace around the globe, full of fossils. I mean, what kind of evidence would you expect from a global flood? You'd expect billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water over the earth. You'd expect that all flesh died, which is what the textbook says, and that the waters covered the continents, which is why you'd expect marine creatures buried up on the continents, and you would expect the creatures to be buried rapidly. All flesh died. All in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. And so, by the way, which creature is mentioned the most in the text of Genesis 6 through 9? Which creatures? Birds. Why would Noah have to take the birds onto the ark if it was only a local flood? For the Christian old earth geologists, there's a clue for you. So there's three evidences for the flooders already. And within those layers, we often find evidence that they are rapidly deposited. We saw those cross beds in the Coconino sandstone. Okay, we know from experimental evidence that the crossbed, the height of the crossbed, is half the height of the original wave. Okay, and also we know what the water current and the water depth would be to produce waves that high. And so in the Coconino sandstone, we can estimate some of the waves would have been up to 60 feet high of sand, and it would have been travelling at 3 to 5 miles per hour, that the waves would have been moving. And so you get the idea that the whole pancake layer could have formed in a matter of a week or two, over 1 million square miles. I mean, that's the sort of evidence you'd expect during the flood. You'd also expect to find copious evidence. So we're ruling out millions of years within the layers, okay? And geologists are recognising that a lot of layers, and to produce the fossils, you have to bury them catastrophically or quickly. They're recognising that maybe some of the layers didn't take a long time to form. So where do they want to put the millions of years then? Between the layers. Well, what did we find today? Okay, you couldn't see the boundary between the Kaibab and the Toroid, and yet there's 5 to 10 million years missing there. What about between the Coconino and the Hermit? You saw that nice knife edge boundary, flat pancake. That goes through the whole width of the canyon. The whole length of the canyon, you see the Coconino sandstone and the Hermit underneath, a flat, featureless knife edge boundary from one end of the canyon to the rest. And remember, everywhere you see the Coconino sandstone, you see the Hermit Formation underneath. So it's extensive, and it indicates that there wasn't millions of years between the layers. We could go on. I could multiply examples, but I'm giving you a quick overview. You also find evidence, therefore, that the sediment was transported huge different distances. The pure sand for the Coconino sandstone, we could see it was whitish looking, the layer, couldn't have been eroded from the Hermit Formation underneath, because the Hermit Formation is primarily silt and mud, and the Coconino is sand. So it's a different material and it's a different colour. So it means if the Hermit is always underneath the Coconino, it means the material for the Coconino had to come from further distance away. And some of the grains in some of these rock layers in the canyon, you can analyse them and get a geochemical fingerprint for them, and you can work out, looking at other layers around the US, where they came from. And some of the sand grains for the Coconino sandstone were eroded from the Appalachians. They were eroded right across the continent, and that is in the secular literature. So it's not us making this up. So a long distance of transport, you'd expect that, because remember, the ocean is coming up onto the continents. And remember, at the beginning of the flood, and I'll talk about this more on another occasion, you're going to have earth movements that are going to generate earthquakes that generate tsunamis. You're still going to have tides during the flood because the moon's still going around the earth. And when you get a global tide system, you're going to have what is called tidal resonance, because the high tide's about 12 hours out of phase, so that they're going to catch up with one another as they go around the globe. And so with tsunamis on that, you're going to get oscillations in the water levels of hundreds of feet, and it's going to sweep over onto the rise and sweep onto the continent, come back, erode, and then go back up into the continent again. So you're going to get a lot of layers stacked up on top of one another very, very quickly. And then we also, two other things we find, one in particular that we're going to go and see, is we came over this morning, those of us that flew out from Las Vegas, from Boulder City Airport, we came up over the North Rim, okay, where the snow was, and then we came down to go to Marble Canyon, and we followed the layers bent down, okay. This plateau was pushed up, and at the edge of the plateau the layers were bent, okay, and the layers were bent smoothly, and we're going to go to one of these places, but you can see that these layers, the whole layer sequence was bent smoothly without fracturing. Now you all know that man-made rock called concrete, if you try to bend it, it's going to snap, it's going to shatter. And everybody, the secularists say that the bending took place over 400 million years after the earliest layers were formed. And you've got thousands of feet of other layers on top. Wouldn't you expect that the layer at the bottom would be rock hard, so that when it was bent, it would shatter? And yet we find these nice smooth folds, and we're going to see several of these on this trip, which has been the focus of a research project that I've been doing these past few years, and we'll talk more about that. But the evidence indicates that the layers were bent where they were all soft, okay, so it was before they were hardened, they bent. Well, they were still soft and wet. And that makes sense because all the layers were stacked up very rapidly during the flood. At the end of the flood, when the valleys sank and the mountains rose, which is what Psalm 104 says, the waters drained off the earth to the boundaries that God set that they would never return again, and God promised there'd never be another flood event. All those layers, therefore, had to be formed very rapidly. So there's some quick pointers for you. We're going to talk more about this through the week, but Joe's here to give us the orientation to this.